Welcome back to Bible study. This is our third lesson in our character study of Joseph, which will focus on the power of forgiveness as we have been focusing on the past couple of weeks. We love for you to spread the word, so help us by going live. If you're watching this at 12 or 6:30, go live on Facebook, please. You can also go to our Twitter page, SMZBC, and retweet that. We're on YouTube where we have the most people watching. That's SMZBC Worships, SMZBC Worships with an S, one word, or dial pad. The mechanism that we use for after Bible study. 804-203-9011, meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC. Get the word out somewhere, some way, shape, or form. You may hear noise as we've been sharing for the last couple of months. There is a 3-story, 67 apartment complex being built literally right across the street from us. And I'm talking about a city street. So literally we have a lot of traffic back and forward, bricklayers, and so all kinds of stuff you're going to probably hear in the background. But to God be the glory. We can't wait to evangelize and invite those persons to be a part of our fellowship. We began our study 2 weeks ago looking at some background family history for Joseph. We talked about his father Jacob. We talked about his mother Rachel, his uncle Esau, and his aunt Leah. We talked about his grandparents, Isaac and Rebekah and Laban. You know all of them and all of the drama that they brought with them. Last week we continue our exploration of the family drama, in particular the 37th chapter of Genesis, which began with Joseph in his parents' home and ends with him in a pit after being sold into captivity by his brothers. Then chapter 38 deals with the story of Judah and his bad decisions that also led to him becoming the father of his daughter-in-law's twin. So just read that, just drama in Genesis 38. So just read that when you can get a chance. But today we're going to start this week with listening to a few verses of Genesis 39 from the New International Version. So check it out.
Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptians because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate.
Last week I shared that we often attribute bad things happening as punishment and good things as blessings. If you missed last week and the first week, you need to go check those out. But throughout the Word of God, we are never told that God's people will be shielded from betrayal or tragedy. Instead, Jesus said that in this life we will have trouble. And over again, the Bible reassures us that in good times and bad times, one thing that we can count on is that God will be with us through it all. As Deuteronomy 31:6 tells us, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. God will never leave you nor forsake you. So as chapter 39 begins, keep in mind that God was not punishing Joseph for bad behavior by having his brothers betray him. And God wasn't rewarding Joseph with favor in Potiphar's house because of Joseph's good behavior. God doesn't withhold trials when we are good, quote unquote, and bring them when we are bad, quote unquote. Regardless of our circumstances, God remains what? Faithful. Joseph was in his parents' home. He was thrown into a pit, yes, and now he is in Potiphar's house. For some, we think that's a come up for young Joseph. After all, he is in a position of power now. But we can't forget that even as the head of Potiphar's household, Joseph was still a slave. He was still a servant. He was bought and paid for by Potiphar. Even though some other slaves may have wanted to be in this position, he was still a young man in a strange land who must have missed his family, must have missed his friends and the familiarity of his food, of his language, and of his culture. How would you feel in this particular situation? I'm going to play the next set of verses, and these next set of verses will explain how Joseph went from his parents' house to the bottom of the pit to Potiphar's house, and then finds himself in prison. Parents, pit, Potiphar, prison. Check out the next few slides.
Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said,
"Ooh, come to bed with me."
But he refused.
"With me in charge,"
He told her,
"my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?"
And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said,
"Come to bed with me."
But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants.
Look!
She said to them,
This Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us, and he came in here to sleep with me. But I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house.
She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story.
That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house.
When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined.
Have you ever felt wrongly accused? Whether someone assumed your guilt, maliciously lied upon you, about you, or in a very subtle way implied your wrongdoing? What was it like to be accused of something that you did not do? As we were preparing for this Bible study, Reverend Butler shared this story, so she put it in writing so that I could read it to you. When I was in middle school, Reverend Butler said, my English teacher gave us a creative writing assignment. We were to write a short story. I don't remember what it was supposed to be about, but I do know that I was a little nerdy and an overachiever. I wrote the story, I typed it up on the big, bulky, square Apple computer in the library, printed it out on the dot matrix printer, stapled it so that it looked like a short book. I was so very proud of my work. Imagine my disappointment and hurt when my teacher asked me to stay after class to discuss my submission. She accused me of plagiarism and threatened to give me a 0 if I didn't admit to stealing someone else's work. As one of 3 black students in his honors English class, I had a sense that she didn't have great expectations for us or for me. She did not believe me no matter how much I tearfully explained that the book was all me. This was before Google, so my aunt / adopted mother had to get involved. We had to bring in my sloppily handwritten draft papers of the story. Finally, she accepted that I was the original author, but she did not give me an A, writing that I had not justified the margins when I had printed it out. Now, this happened when I was either 13 or 14 years of age. But even writing out the story to share with you today, all kinds of feelings came back about being wrongfully accused. And in the grand scheme of things, I know that me being accused of plagiarizing may seem minor when compared to people like Joseph who've been wrongly accused of a crime that landed them in prison, but it didn't feel good. When we are wrongly accused, now I'm shifting away from Reverend Butler's story. When we are wrongly accused, our sense of justice emerges. We may struggle with whether we would defend ourselves, provide evidence to prove our innocence, to bring up the faults of our accusers, to write passive-aggressive comments about the situation on social media, to tell others our side of the story. As a slave in Potiphar's house, Joseph's words meant nothing against that of his master's wife. So it seemed that Joseph endured temptation day after day until it finally culminated in a wrongful accusation that would serve as a second major betrayal in his life. Now, for context, some Bible commentaries assert that Potiphar might have been castrated. In fact, the text refers to him as a word that is often translated eunuch. In Egyptian culture, many pharaohs feared a takeover of their dynasty, so they had their most prominent leaders become eunuchs so that they could focus more on their jobs and refrain from the temptation for a coup. In any case, we know that from the text that Potiphar's wife began to see Joseph as an object of her desire. Joseph was a young man, so I'm sure he had physical desires too. He may have stressed or struggled with temptations to give in to what feels good in the moment instead of what ultimately would please God. He might have been tempted, believing that if they were discreet, it would be okay. But instead of giving in, Joseph gave Potiphar's wife reasons why he could not do what she was asking. First, with me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. Two, no one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except for you, because you are his wife. Three, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Still, Potiphar's wife treated Joseph like property. He became an object to her. But even though she propositioned him day after day, he continued to maintain his integrity. Joseph stayed as far away from Potiphar's wife as possible. When we are bombarded by temptation, what can we do to stay true to what we believe, even at the risk of our jobs, our friends, our own very lives? The answer may vary depending upon your situation, but we must strive to develop holy boundaries and avoid temptation. And we've got to do these things to maintain our integrity and keep growing in faith. Now, on the one hand, running can be the mark of a coward, but on the other hand, sometimes God calls for us to flee. The Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Timothy 2:22, flee the evil desires, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. God also might call us to flee a toxic relationship, a compromising job, or a spiritually abusive relationship or group. While we cannot run away from every problem, there is a time when God says the best thing to do is get out. Staying focused on God's truth rather than human desire cost Joseph greatly. It led to a second betrayal, yes, which took him from his initial captivity as a slave in Potiphar's house to a much worse imprisonment. Things went from bad to worse for Joseph, which raises a question. If God's hand of favor was on him, why did all of these bad things happen to Joseph? Just as we can't sort out all of the reasons for the difficult circumstances in our lives, we don't know for sure why these bad things happened to Joseph. However, from the perspective of hindsight, we can see some benefits to Joseph's trials. Theologian Warren Wiersbe writes, had he stayed home with his pampering father, Joseph might not have developed the kind of character that comes from hard work and obeying orders. God's method for building us is to give us a job to do and people to obey. God tests us as servants before God promotes us as rulers. Sometimes you have to learn to follow so that you can lead. Joseph's great-granddaddy Abraham received a promise from God in Genesis 12. All the families on earth will be blessed through you, quote unquote. Joseph brought this blessing with him even as a slave. While we don't get too many glimpses into Joseph's thoughts and feelings, we do see a boy becoming a man as God blesses his administration of Potiphar's house. God wants us, me and you, like Joseph, to recognize God's favor so that we can focus our eyes on blessing others rather than sitting in our own self-pity for all of the wrongs done against us. The opportunity to serve others can become God's gift to help us on the journey to forgiveness. God continues to bless us even when we feel like we can't sink any lower. While we can't always make sense of the whys and the hows of what we're enduring when others hurt us, we can rest assured that God will never leave us or forsake us. All right, let's keep on going with Genesis 39.
But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did.
Now here we are. Joseph has gone from his parents to the pit to Potiphar's house to now he's stuck in prison. Joseph is a prisoner, waiting for God-given dreams to come true with no evidence that things will change anytime soon. How could he continue to believe God's promise in prison? He was probably still processing his feelings about his brothers when now he has a new opportunity to forgive after being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. And I can imagine that it was difficult to realize that the boss who had been so impressed with him was now furious with him for something he did not do. Could Joseph have wondered why God allowed more unfair treatment? During periods of waiting and isolation such as Joseph experienced, we have much time to think about and process our circumstances. These are days when bitterness is knocking on our door, and we may want to build walls to protect ourselves from being hurt again. But that may not be the best option for you. Let's pick up with our boy Joseph in chapter 40.
Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house,
Why do you look so sad today?
We both had dreams.
They answered.
But there is no one to interpret them.
Then Joseph said to them,
Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams.
So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him,
In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand.
This is what it means.
Joseph said to him,
The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon.
When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph,
I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head.
This is what it means.
Joseph said.
The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh.
Now the third day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of his chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him.
Do you ever wonder if Joseph woke up with anticipation the day after the cupbearer was restored? Did he convince himself that maybe it would take a week or two to get the balls of justice rolling? At some point, maybe after the first month or the first year, he must have realized that the cupbearer isn't coming through for him. Joseph's hopes of getting out of prison seemed to be dashed. Perhaps Joseph was angry at the cupbearer for forgetting him. Melissa Spolstra says, in the soil of reflection, quote, seeds of bitterness can grow strong roots as we rehearse the wrongs done to us, unquote. The reality for Joseph and for us is that we cannot control some events in our lives. Joseph had no control over being his father's favorite, betrayed, sold by his brothers, bought by Potiphar, elevated in the rank, tempted by Potiphar's wife, falsely accused and imprisoned, and forgotten by a man he had just helped. We too have things in our lives that we wish were different, but we have no power to change. Right now, as much as I love my job of serving our community, there are some difficult moments. There's a case that I just had last night that was probably one of the most, well, not probably, the most difficult cases that I've heard in my 12 years. And many people left disappointed in me and my decision. But, you know, I wish things were different, but they are what they are. You know, I've parented 2 teenagers at one point, parenting a third one. I wish sometimes that I could skip the teenage years of parenting and move from toddler, elementary age, straight to adulthood. And though Joseph could not change some of his circumstances, he did have control over his responses to those events. I preached and taught about this particular thing many, many times. You cannot control other people. You cannot control the weather. You cannot control the actions really of anybody else outside of your life, outside of yourself. But you can control your response. Joseph couldn't control his circumstances, but he could govern his own spirit. Though initially he may have flaunted his father's favoritism, he learned to work hard. He learned to do what? Honor God and maintain integrity, even during his time of captivity. Joseph was a human being, and I'm sure he had to work through hurt, had to work through hate. However, he was able to move toward healing. If he had been throwing himself a personal pity party, he probably would not have noticed, let alone been able to help the baker and the cupbearer when he saw them looking sad. I just preached the other week about being committed and following Jesus, even if the way seems hard. On this Christian journey, y'all, there are times when you will find that God is more concerned, hear me, with our character than with our comfort. In our times of waiting, God prepares us for new beginnings, whether they are big or small. We all have realities that we cannot change in life. Like Joseph, the only variable we can control is how we will choose to respond to these events and the people involved in them. Will we maintain our integrity when no one is looking? Will we choose joy even when our circumstances go from bad to worse? Will we posture ourselves for forgiveness, posture ourselves for vengeance? Like Joseph, we have no control over the wrongs done to us. Friends can neglect us. Church folk can choose to gossip about us. Significant others or friends can or may betray us. In the fire of an offense, our flesh encourages us to do what? Retreat, whether it's in bitterness or not, or to fight back. But God calls us to God's self during these times. In her book, Choosing Forgiveness, Nancy Lee DeMoss writes, God does not want you to run away from your pain, but to run to God in the midst of your pain, to fly head on into the fury of it, to face it, to let God meet you right where it hurts and give you the grace to be set free from any bondage that may hurt you. It is possible, my brothers and sisters, to be free. You don't have to stay in the prison of unforgiveness and bitterness. You don't have to stay in the prison of unforgiveness and bitterness, which is far worse than the dungeon where Joseph served out his undeserved prison sentence. Joseph discovered the secret of a soft heart and the power of forgiveness in the midst of great betrayal. And as we continue to study his life, I pray that we will see his humanity and the reality of his pain, as well as the ultimate freedom that he found in a close relationship with God. God can do the same for us as we start our own journey toward forgiveness. Now, getting ready for this Bible study, we came across the mention of this book, The Sunflower, one of the possibilities and limits of forgiveness. It's written by Holocaust survivor Simon Wiesenthal. He recounts his experience with a mortally wounded Nazi during World War II. One day on a work assignment at his old high school, which had been turned into a makeshift hospital, Simon was summoned by a nurse to come into a patient's room. He found himself with a dying young German soldier who was explaining some terrible acts that he had committed. This soldier followed orders alongside his peers to round up Jewish families into a building where the doors were locked and then set on fire. Horrific. Ordered to shoot anyone who jumped from the second story, this 18-year-old man, wrapped in bandages and struggling to breathe, desperately pleaded with Simon to forgive him for participating in this tragedy. His conscience left him in more agony than his wounds. Simon walked away without saying anything. He could not relieve this man's pain while living his own nightmare under Hitler's regime in a Limburg concentration camp. After surviving the war, Simon spent the rest of his life pondering what he should have done in that moment. This event became his before and after story. Should he have granted forgiveness? Was it even in his power to offer such a thing? Theologians, rabbis, politicians, and people from many different backgrounds wrote responses to his question with mixed responses. What about you? How would you respond to Simon's question of whether he should have forgiven the Nazi soldier? In the same way, Joseph's story brings to the surface other tough questions. Does choosing to forgive condone injustice? Are some sins unforgivable? Are we always to forgive, even when someone takes part in an evil action? As Joseph languished in prison, was he giving up on justice if he forgave his brothers and Potiphar's wife? Does forgiving someone condone his or her terrible behavior? If someone whose son was murdered or whose daughter was abused asks you these questions, how would you answer? Yes, these are hard questions. No, there are no easy answers. But I believe that the prison years in Joseph's life shows us that during the most difficult of times, we often make choices of the heart and mind that shape how we act and speak later. In Genesis 40:14 and 15, Joseph said to the cupbearer, "When all goes well with you, my friend, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." I think it's important to note that Joseph acknowledged that he had been mistreated. He told the two servants that he had been kidnapped and had done nothing to deserve being in prison. Though ultimately Joseph forgave the ones who kidnapped and sold him, he never said that what they did was okay. This distinction is important. Forgiving someone does not excuse or minimize the pain that the person has caused, and often consequences remain for those who have sinned against us. Last week, I shared that the first step to forgiveness is acknowledging your pain. Two more steps I want to briefly share about today are speaking up and asking for help. It is possible to forgive others and still hold them accountable for their behavior. We can forgive others while speaking up about their actions and asking for help and seeking justice on our behalf. Sometimes Christians will say that speaking up about wrongs done to us and asking for justice means that you haven't really forgiven someone. However, the two are not mutually exclusive. We can speak up and ask for help in righting the wrongs committed against us while simultaneously working through the stages of forgiveness. In Genesis 40, we see that Joseph wasn't some doormat of a man who let others walk all over him without speaking up. He did not condone or make excuses for his brother's behavior or his wrongful imprisonment. Rather, he told the two royal servants that his sentence was unfair and that he did not deserve the consequences that he was facing daily in prison. Now, depending on your situation, you need to exercise discernment and guidance of the Holy Spirit in order to know where and when and how to speak up. Because there is a time to be quiet and let God fight our battles, as well as situations when love is to cover sin. So you need to consider whether you should say something in prayer to others or directly to those who have wronged you. In Genesis 40, we learn that Joseph's words to the baker and the cupbearer that there is a time to speak up about unfair treatment. When we have been mistreated, betrayed, abused, or sinned against, in any way, it's okay to say, this was not right, and I did not deserve to be treated in this way. In fact, if we excuse behavior rather than calling it sinful and wrong, we prevent true forgiveness from actually taking place. Lewis Smidas explains it this way, quote, forgiving is tough, excusing is easy. What a mistake it is to confuse forgiving with being mushy, soft, gutless, and oh, so understanding. Before we forgive, we stiffen our spine and we hold a person accountable. And only then, in tough-minded judgment, can we do the outrageously impossible thing. We can forgive, unquote. Forgiveness does not negate the wrongness of a crime, but instead readily admits that wrong was done. Pardon isn't necessary if sin wasn't committed. Simon Wiesenthal might not have been able to forgive the soldier that day for many reasons. First of all, the crimes were not committed against him. How could he speak for the family and friends of those who were burned to death in the house that day? He also needed time to process and discern through the haze of hunger, mistreatment, and injustice in his own life. Forgiveness often requires time. If it happens too quickly, one might question the sincerity and depth of it. Perhaps the art of prospering in our prisons involves sorting through wrongs done to us. As you think about ways you are suffering the consequences of what others have done to you, whether it's parents, friends, co-workers, or strangers who got close enough to harm you personally, it's okay to say, I did not deserve this. Joseph acknowledged his hurt. He spoke up about the wrongdoing. Then, and this is hard for some of us, including me, Joseph asked for help. First, Joseph asked for the cupbearer to remember him and show him kindness. This is a request for pity, for the cupbearer to understand his pain. Joseph had been falsely accused, and he asked for kindness or compassion. The Hebrew word used here, hesed, is the same word that we find in Genesis 39:21. The Lord was with him. He showed kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. You've heard this word before. We talked about it in our last Bible study series, that is. God was showing Joseph kindness in prison, and Joseph was asking for kindness from a flesh and blood human who might be able to help him. Even though Joseph trusted God, he still communicated his need in the moment. Joseph not only asked for emotional understanding, but also for specific steps to be taken. He asked the cupbearer to tell Pharaoh about his situation so that he could get out of prison. Pharaoh was the highest authority in Egypt and even was worshipped as a deity. And Joseph had no reservations about going straight to the top with his problem. He thought his circumstances were worth mentioning to the highest authority in the land. When we are in our own prisons of waiting and are feeling unjustly treated, we need to be willing to ask for help as Joseph did. I'm sure Joseph bent God's ear many a times, pleading for a way out. He also appealed to someone around him who might be able to help him, the cupbearer. Many of us suffer in silence. We isolate ourselves, thinking no one will understand our situation. Though trials are unique and no one else has our exact circumstance, we can follow Joseph's example and open our eyes to see others around us in somewhat similar situations. As you consider your current opportunities to forgive, are there others around you who may have experienced something similar? Whatever hurtful situations you are experiencing, look around you in your time of waiting to see if there is someone who you can share your burden with. And then ask this person to help. Whether you need compassion or specific action to be taken on your behalf, follow God's Spirit in taking steps to ask for it. The purpose for asking for help is to not share your viewpoint to get people to join your side of a conflict. When we truly want to grow in forgiveness, we're not looking for people who will tell us that we are always right. We need compassion, but also wisdom and truth. So we must exercise good judgment in asking for help from somebody that we respect. Joseph's journey to forgiveness involved an acknowledgement of the pain, speaking up and asking for help. And while I wish I could tell you that when you follow these steps, things will happen right away, but Joseph's plea for help didn't bring change immediately. At the end of Genesis 40, we heard that the cupbearer did not remember Joseph when he got out of prison. Yet, in due time, Joseph's request ultimately led to a turn of events that changed the entire course of his life. Whether your answer comes in 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years, you can speak up and ask for God for help as God leads. Though it may seem that those you ask are not being helpful, keep waiting. Trust that God will release you from your prison cell at just the right moment. As Joseph sat in his time of waiting, he had a choice about which thoughts and feelings he would dwell on and nurture. Like us, his default would be to rehearse wrongs, let bitterness grow, and allow his wounds to fester. What we naturally want to do in a relational situation is often the wrong thing. People are a hodgepodge of love, selfishness, kindness, fear, and the list could go on. No one is perfect. Most people are not truly evil. They are just people who make some good decisions and some pretty bad ones. The battle for truth in relationships is often fought in our own head and in our own heart. We need God's Holy Spirit desperately so that God can help us see people clearly, so that God can soften our hearts, and God can revise our feelings to fall in line with God's. God longs to free us from fantasizing about our villain's demise. Joseph probably did a little bit of that. He was human, as I told you. But he would have had to get off the mental hamster wheel of negative thoughts toward his brothers and his boss in order to bring his thoughts and feelings in line with God's grace. Perhaps for years, some of us will think of the person who wronged us. What will we do with these thoughts? The Apostle Paul gives us an answer in 2 Corinthians 10:5. Quote, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. That's the New International Version, unquote. Like Joseph, Paul served prison sentences when he was waiting to be remembered. Paul penned these words in a Roman prison. He knew what it meant to be a captive. Prisoners don't get to do what they want to do or go where they want to go. Paul tells us to put our unforgiving thoughts into a prison cell. We are the warden of our thoughts. God tells us that with the power of the Holy Spirit, we can take thoughts captive and make them obey Christ. I'm almost done, but let me end with this. The next time your head starts spinning with thoughts focused on your own pity party, take those thoughts captive. When all you can think about is getting even or obsessing what another person has done to you, put those thoughts in a cell and lock the door. Then I want you to repeat 2 Corinthians 10:5. We demolish arguments and every pretension and set itself up against the knowledge of God, and we can take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. I want you to repeat 2 Corinthians 10:5 until your thoughts and your feelings come around to the side of truth. You'll soon notice that you are on the outside of your prison door, holding the keys to a productive mental activity such as praying and encouraging others. Make a decision that you will not waste hours dwelling on negative emotions. seeing askew view of people and replaying old tales of wrongs done to us steals time that we could be spending listening to the voice of God for the direction that we need. You may need to be on guard against those destructive thought patterns when you are alone in your car, on your lunch break, or doing a mindless chore such as dishes, washing dishes, or laundry. To combat the thoughts, you may need to redeem these times by listening to some music, some gospel music, praying, thinking of things to be thankful for. You can listen to jazz music, anything that will soothe you. All right? Thinking on things to be thankful for. Going back, listening to some of my sermons, Reverend Butler's sermons, memorizing biblical scripture. All right, I look forward to you coming over to Dialpad. That's it for today. For our after Bible study discussion, especially if you're listening at 12 or 6:30 on this Wednesday, okay? This week, I want to hear how you will answer this question. Of the 3 steps of the journey to forgiveness discussed so far, which of these 3 steps is the hardest for you? Acknowledging the hurt, speaking up about it, or asking for help. Which is hardest for you, and why do you think that is? If you're watching at noon today, Wednesday, 6:30 this evening, Wednesday, I want you to jump on now onto Dialpad. meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC, or simply call 804-203-9011. All right? Join us Thursday morning for our prayer call on Dialpad. Join us Friday if you need food from 12 to 1. And then join us in worship on Sunday. In person if you can. If not, we'll be online 10:45. And then we'll see you next Wednesday. All right? Jump on after Bible study.